So if the new president, Marcos Jr., can somehow toughen up to China and then lean toward a little bit maybe to the center, that will greatly affect the whole South China Sea situations. More countries will follow Philippines' example. I mean, we are seeing that Vietnam is having a very strong attitude toward China, but other countries like Malaysia or Brunei, they are seeing what Philippines is going to do, and then probably this will be collectively would form ASEAN common policy toward China.
The PRC is the one that is in a way coercing and forcing the situation to be resolved in its favor. And they're actually preventing us, for example, from conducting oil exploration in our own waters. And they have been elbowing our fishermen out of their fishing grounds physically or through intimidation by their ships.
Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has won the presidential elections in the Philippines, Taiwan's southerly neighbor. His late father ruled the country in a brutal dictatorship that lasted 2 decades. But could the election of the son, Marcos Jr., represent a turning point for the Philippines as it navigates its way between two great powers, the United States and China? Welcome to TaiwanPlus Point, offering insight and analysis on the latest global news from a Taiwan perspective. With me today are Professor J. Batongbacal of the University of the Philippines College of Law and a maritime affairs expert, and also Mr. Chenlung, Deputy Editor-in-Chief, one of Taiwan's leading newspapers, United Daily News. Thank you both for joining Point today. Marcos Jr. won in a landslide vote, Professor, and yet some critics are saying that he stole his way into the presidential palace through a campaign of fake news and false narratives, especially about his father's so-called golden years. Do you agree?
Well, I agree that the election was preceded really by a massive disinformation campaign and revisionist history that the likes of which we have never seen before. It was fueled by social media, and it was really widespread. And it was really alarming to us who were observing this unfold. So the fact that he won the election on the backs of this kind of campaign really raises questions as to the kind of administration he will have in the next 6 years.
Marcos Sr.'s presidency was notorious for 21 years of state-sponsored killings and corruption. Many are fearing his son's election could signal the regression of democracy in the region, especially now that he has this supermajority in Congress. Professor, how do you think democracy will fare?
Well, not very well, I'm afraid. The prognosis is not very good from all signs, because even prior to his election, Philippine democracy was already suffering a lot of blows from the Duterte administration. So many of the democratic institutions have really been weakened, and even government institutions such as the Ombudsman and several other gatekeepers, shall we say, of democratic values really were under major revision under his term. So it has, to people, it has really weakened the democratic institutions in the Philippines.
To forget crimes against past generations.
There's a similarity between Taiwan and Philippines in terms of dictatorship. We see that in Philippines, about half of the voters, they don't have any memory of what happened for the Marcos Sr. had done during that period. Similar in Taiwan, we have the Chiang Kai-shek family who had ruled in Taiwan for many, many years. Chiang Kai-shek was considered a dictator. He had done a lot of white terror during the 50s and 60s, but his son, Jiang Jingguo, was kind of enlightened rulers that still Taiwan people had a lot of favorable feeling for Jiang Jingguo. Now the question is, the grandson of Jiang Jingguo is going to run for Taipei mayor this year, and what kind of attitude he will have for the transformational justice that we have in Taiwan. Just like in Philippines, people are questioning Marcos Jr., whether he had any reflection on his father's rule.
Marcos won in a landslide vote, as I mentioned, 60% majority. Has the Philippines forgotten about the crimes?
Well, unfortunately, I think for the younger generation, the ones who were born after 1986, they have been susceptible really to revisionist history because of the prevalence of social media. Social media has become the school for quite a lot of them, especially the poor who do not have access to your regular education. So it is fair to say that for the younger generation, they have absolutely no memory of those times. And the generation that did experience those events, those in my generation, for example, are really surprised and disappointed that those things that we had seen and experienced during our formative years have been so quickly swept away by the likes of TikTok and YouTube, really.
Let's turn now to great power rivalry. Marcos Jr. has spoken with Chinese leader Xi Jinping by phone and saying that his country's ties with China will expand and, quote unquote, shift to a higher gear. Professor, what do you think we can expect?
Well, I think we can expect that the incoming administration will again pursue China for economic benefits and support, because even before, the economic managers had been pinning their hopes on accessing China's wealth and markets. But as 6 years had gone by under the Duterte administration, it turns out that it wasn't as big as they were hoping for. And instead, the economic ties were more on the smaller scale, shall we say, smaller businesses, which tried to make up for it in volume, I suppose. But then we also had the more prominent businesses like Philippine offshore gambling operations being the ones that sort of represented Chinese investments to many people. So that put a kind of a dark pall on the economic front there. So I'd assume that the next administration will try to recover from that and perhaps try to extract still more promises and support from China, because again, all the economic thinkers seem to think that the source of growth in Asia really is China, and they have not really seen money coming from, say, the traditional partners like Europe or the United States. Instead, they look at China as the source of growth, really.
Chenlung, this would seem to complicate US attempts to curtail China's influence in the region.
I think what the US want to do is try to stop China's influence in the Southeast Asia, which is quite difficult to do. I mean, for instance, China is using its Belt and Road initiative and try to ask other countries to make loan and to have infrastructure constructions. And that put a lot of countries into debt. That's the debt trap. I think in Philippines is experiencing the same kind of things happening to them. But Marcos Jr. is running on the platform of economic revival. He wants to revive the economic prosperity during his father's rule. That's the promise he made to the Philippine people. So the number one priority will be economic development. While the US is trying to do is to alarm the Philippines that you are risking your own security by trading your South China Sea's claim to this kind of economic benefit. I think the new president would have to balance those two. And I think there's still a very strong nationalistic feeling in Philippines that he cannot give in that much to the South China Sea claim. And that is the thing he has to be aware of.
Can Marcos Jr. really deliver on his campaign promises of patriotism and national unity?
Well, it's going to be very difficult, I think, at this point, especially if China is involved, because in spite of Duterte's efforts, the people simply have not regarded China in the same way, and their trust ratings all throughout have always been among the lowest, partly because of the South China Sea issues, and probably maybe long-standing suspicion about Chinese motives, in spite of all the efforts. If Mr. Marcos is going to deliver on his promises, however, I think he will try to, he's going to need as much help as he can from even international partners, because some of those promises he made for economic benefits for the people really are very unrealistic, shall we say, and certain economists have already pointed that out. So I think that he will, of course, try his best to deliver on some of them, and it will be the people who will be the ones to decide whether they'll be satisfied with that or not.
How will Marcos Jr. affect the Philippines' position on the South China Sea?
I think what he said during the campaign may not necessarily become a policy when he really get in office. That is because during the campaign, he still need President Duterte's support, and he had to follow President Duterte's foreign policy on China. And his running mate, not really a running, since Philippine system is they run independently. The vice president is President Duterte's daughter. So that is another factor. But I think that a lot of people are concerned what's going to be his policy on South China Sea right now. Because we are seeing that now China and the US had intensified their rivalry, and tension is being mounting. Not only Xi Jinping called the president-elect Marcos Jr., President Biden also called, is what they are doing is to win his favor, especially this time during the special summit between ASEAN and the United States. The Philippines did not go, neither Duterte or the president-elect Marcos is going to Washington. So when President Biden is coming to Asia, he had to win the favor of Philippines and other ASEAN countries as well.
How important is the Philippines to the region?
I think, for one, Philippines is a major member of ASEAN. So what's the attitude of Philippines would greatly affect ASEAN as a whole. And the second is that exactly the International Tribunal is regarding the South China Sea's quarrel between Philippines and China. So if the new president, Marcos Jr., can somehow toughen up to China and then lean toward a little bit maybe to the center, that will greatly affect the whole South China Sea situations. More countries will follow Philippines' example. I mean, we are seeing that Vietnam is having a very strong attitude toward China. But other countries like Malaysia or Brunei, they are seeing what Philippines is going to do. And then probably this will be collectively would form ASEAN common policy toward China.
Professor, just before the presidential election, Xi Jinping spoke with Duterte by phone and agreed to, quote unquote, broaden the space for positive engagements in dealing with the disputes of the South China Sea. What do you interpret this to mean now for Marcos Jr.?
Well, it's difficult to say, because even back then, broadening engagements with China did not prevent the onset of incidents and friction between China and Duterte. So I think that at this point, the signaling that is going on between China, the US, and Mr. Marcos is really more to try to project an image of stability and good relations, I suppose. For China, that is the most valuable, because they keep on harping on stability and and good relations between the countries and their ability to talk it out. But as we have seen, talking does not necessarily mean that on the ground level things are going well. And we've seen incidents take place despite all the mechanisms that they keep highlighting. So for the next administration, I would think that again, China will try to keep the Philippines on that track of using the bilateral consultation mechanisms and then trying to downplay basically these disputes.
Professor, Taiwan, whose official name is Republic of China, is also a claimant in the South China Sea. Where do the claims of the Philippines and the ROC overlap? And does that mean that both China and Taiwan are causing concern in your country?
Well, the original claims to the South China Sea were made by Taiwan in the first place. No? But in the years that have followed, we've seen that the mainland, the People's Republic of China, has in a way taken it much further than the way it seemed to be initially presented by Taiwan. So the question, the lingering question really is how congruent are the positions of both the PRC and Taiwan on the South China Sea? Is it really as expansive and, to our mind, excessive and contrary to international law based on the arbitration? We actually haven't really clarified that yet, at least officially. But for academics like us, I think the concern right now more is the PRC, because the PRC is the one that is in a way coercing and forcing the situation to be resolved in its favor. And they're actually preventing us, for example, from conducting oil exploration in our own waters. And they have been elbowing our fishermen out of their fishing grounds physically or through intimidation by their ships. No? But we don't see that coming from Taiwan. So there's always still that hope that at least with Taiwan, there could be sincere discussions and settlements and negotiations in the future. Because right now with PRC, that doesn't seem to be the case. They seem to be really trying to impose their own view and solution, the one that favors them only in the South China Sea.
Tom, do you agree with the professor?
This is a very tricky question in Taiwan because on the one hand, Taiwan is not really abandoning its 9-line policy yet. But on the other hand, the current government want to have good terms with the neighboring countries. We don't like to be like China, very aggressive, using the fishing boats or even the marine police to harass neighboring countries. But now, during the tribunal, the case is also against Taiwan. I mean, at the time, I still remember Taiwan government during the Mao administration objects strongly about the rulings. And this is an issue that I think both for Taiwan and Philippines have to sit down and work it out. Although we both have our claims on South China Sea's rights, but still there is a room for cooperation. I think that is the right attitude for us to resolve the issues.
One of Marcos's campaign promises was to slash the rising cost of food. You've spoken about the close link between the South China Sea and the food crisis in the Philippines. Do you think Marcos Jr.'s supporters will be let down?
They may be in for a lot of disappointment, especially on the food situation. With respect to the South China Sea, for example, if it's fisheries, right now the word we're getting from our fishermen in the coast, the ones we work with, really is that their catch has gone down to practically zero. And yet the Philippines is importing fish from China. So it really leaves a bad taste in the mouth for them.
So fish that's been fished in the Philippines water.
And really the reports are rather disheartening about their conditions there in fishing. And then when it comes to agriculture, like his promise to bring rice prices down to only 20 pesos, that's already half of the farm gate prices of rice. So it means somebody is going to bear the loss. And unfortunately, given our system, it might be the farmers who will bear that loss if ever. So I don't think that was a realistic promise in the first place. And given the economic situation that we have to recover from the pandemic, and yet the Philippines also has rising debt, and the debt to GDP ratio went up again in the last month. So, and there will be lots of pressure for taxes to be raised in order to fund also all the services that are now in large demand. So something is got to give with that, and I'm afraid that it might hit especially the food situation for many people.
The Philippines is a key investment destination under Taiwan's new southbound policy. And in 2021, we generated over $600 million US, created more than 40,000 jobs. Marcos has an ambitious infrastructure plan, including building digital infrastructure. Do you think Taiwanese investment could play a role in strengthening bilateral ties?
Certainly, I think that is the room for future cooperations. And I think it's more than Taiwan's own new southbound policy. What Taiwan should be doing is try to incorporate the regional policy.
Mm-hmm. Professor, if I can...
Oh yes, I agree completely, because Taiwan really has a big role that it can play, especially in terms of agriculture. Prior to arriving here, I had a meeting with the representative of Taiwan in Manila, and I was actually surprised that they have programs for assisting and training in agriculture, Filipino farmers. So I think that is key, because increasing agricultural productivity really is the only way to try to address the food security issues. For several decades now, the agricultural sector has been falling in terms of its participation and contribution to the economy. And instead, it's the service sector that has been going up. So this will create a huge gap in our food production in the future unless we arrest it. And it seems that the only way to do that will be to try to innovate in agriculture. And this can be done, I know, from with assistance from Taiwan, especially the way that Taiwan has been able to maximize its agricultural productivity despite having a relatively limited land area. And also in terms of the digital infrastructure, Taiwan is recognized as one of the region's innovators in technology, especially digital technology. And we've seen also how Taiwan has used it even in governance, in improving governance. So I think that is something that really would benefit also the Philippines. So hopefully this will be tapped in the future.
If I could turn now to military aspects. Both Taiwan and the Philippines are part of the first island chain. It's the Cold War line of defense that contains the influence of Russia, North Korea, and China. The US and the Philippines share a mutual defense treaty where each country will come to the aid of the other if attacked. Professor, last month, thousands of American and Filipino forces completed one of the largest joint military exercises under Duterte's reign, including in waters near Taiwan, which is a result of the increasing assertiveness of China. Do you see these sorts of exercises continuing under Marcos Jr.?
I think they will. As we've seen, despite Duterte's preferences, the Philippine-US alliance was able to persist, no? And it actually had seen its greatest threat with the declared abrogation of the visiting forces agreement by Duterte, but he eventually withdrew from that. So I think that's a sign of the strength and resilience of that relationship. So similarly, if Marcos wants to ensure his administration stability, I think that he would also see the need to maintain that relationship because, well, when you think about it, his father's administration was ousted because of discontent in the military. So if he makes the same mistakes, he could be facing a similar situation in the future, so he has to be careful. And the only way for him to be able to do that will be to basically keep the Philippine-US military relationship healthy. And that is done through these exercises and this alliance the management of the alliance.
Tonglun, with a strengthened relationship with China, what impacts might there be on US-Philippine security ties?
I think nowadays the competition between China and the United States had intensified. I mean, 10 years ago, there's a Scarborough Shoal incident there's a minor incursion between the Chinese and Philippines Navy. And at the time, the U.S. Is not come forward to help Philippines. That was considered a major strategic mistakes that U.S. had been committing. Now, after 10 years, with the conflict intensify, now the U.S. is saying that we'll come to Philippines' aid if such kind of things happen again. So you can see it's a very different scenario now. The U.S. had providing a lot of security support to Philippines, and now Philippines would feel assured that if such kind of bully coming from China again, that I think the Philippines will count on the U.S. to come to their aid.
Professor, the Philippines just recently agreed with Japan to expand the existing defense cooperation. Do you see any possibilities for Taiwan and the Philippines to have a defense cooperation?
Well, I'm actually doing research on that because there is, I think, some room for even defense cooperation between the two countries. The only problem really is that on the Philippine side, because our policy towards Taiwan and the One China policy has never really been very, very clear. And we've seen incidents, for example, even during the Aquino administration, where you really needed to question whether there actually was a consistent policy. So I hope that there is. I know that there are informal discussions, but I don't know if they will become, they will be elevated to really formal cooperation agreements, but we shall see.
We'll have to end it there. Thank you to my guests, Professor J. Batongbacal and Tonglun Guo, and thank you to the viewers for joining us on Point.